4. A materialist psychiatry. The famous hypothesis put forward by the psychiatrist G. de Clérambault seems well-founded. Delirium, which is by nature global and systematic, is a secondary phenomenon, a consequence of partial and local automatistic phenomena. Delirium is in fact characteristic of the recording that is made of the process of production of the desiring machines. And though there are syntheses and disorders, affections, that are peculiar to this recording process, as we see in paranoia and even in the paranoid forms of schizophrenia, it does not constitute an autonomous sphere, for it depends on the functioning and the breakdowns of desiring machines. Nonetheless, Clérambault used the term mental automatism to designate only athematic phenomena, echolalia, the uttering of odd sounds, or sudden irrational outbursts, which he attributed to the mechanical effects of infections or intoxications. Moreover, he explained a large part of delirium in turn as an effect of automatism. As for the rest of it, the personal part, in his view it was of the nature of a reaction, and had to do with character, the manifestations of which might well precede the automatism, as in the paranoiac character, for instance. Hence, Clérambault regarded automatism as merely a neurological mechanism in the most general sense of the word, rather than a process of economic production involving desiring machines. As for history, he was content merely to mention its innate or acquired nature. Clérambault is the Feuerbach of psychiatry, in the sense in which Marx remarks, "Whenever Feuerbach looks at things as a materialist, there is no history in his works, and whenever he takes history into account, he is no longer a materialist." A truly materialist psychiatry can be defined, on the contrary, by the twofold task it sets itself: introducing desire into the mechanism, and introducing production into desire. There is no very great difference between false materialism and typical forms of idealism. The theory of schizophrenia is formulated in terms of three concepts that constitute its trinary schema: disassociation, Kraepelin, autism, Bleuler, and space-time or being in the world, Binswanger. The first of these is an explanatory concept that supposedly locates the specific dysfunction or primary deficiency. The second is an ideational concept indicating the specific nature of the effect of the disorder, the delirium itself, or the complete withdrawal from the outside world. The detachment from reality, accompanied by a relative or an absolute predominance of the schizophrenic's inner life. The third concept is a descriptive one, discovering or rediscovering the delirious person in his own specific world. What is common to these three concepts is the fact that they all relate the problem of schizophrenia to the ego through the intermediary of the body image, the final avatar of the soul, a vague conjoining of the requirements of spiritualism and positivism. The ego, however, is like Daddy Mummy. The schizo has long since ceased to believe in it. He is somewhere else, beyond or behind or below these problems, rather than immersed in them. And wherever he is, there are problems, insurmountable sufferings, unbearable needs. But why try to bring him back to what he has escaped from? Why set him back down amid problems that are no longer problems to him? Why mock his truth by believing that we have paid it its due by merely figuratively taking our hats off to it? There are those who will maintain that the schizo is incapable of uttering the word I, and that we must restore his ability to pronounce this hallowed word. All of which the schizo sums up by saying, "They're fucking me over again. I won't say I anymore. I'll never utter the word again. It's just too damn stupid. Every time I hear it, I'll use the third person instead, if I happen to remember to. If it amuses them. And it won't make one bit of difference. And if he does chance to utter the word I again, that won't make any difference either. He is too far removed from these problems, too far past them." Even Freud never went beyond this narrow and limited conception of the ego, and what prevented him from doing so was his own tripartite formula, the Oedipal neurotic one. daddy, mummy, me. We may well ponder the possibility that the analytic imperialism of the Oedipus complex led Freud to rediscover, and to lend all the weight of his authority to, the unfortunate misapplication of the concept of autism to schizophrenia. For we must not delude ourselves, Freud doesn't like schizophrenics. He doesn't like their resistance to being Oedipalized, and tends to treat them more or less as animals. They mistake words for things, he says. They are apathetic, narcissistic, cut off from reality, incapable of achieving transference. They resemble philosophers, an undesirable resemblance. The question as to how to deal analytically with the relationship between drives, pulsions, and symptoms, between the symbol and what is symbolized, has arisen again and again. Is this relationship to be considered causal, or is it a relationship of comprehension, a mode of expression? The question, however, has been posed too theoretically. The fact is, from the moment that we are placed within the framework of Oedipus, from the moment that we are measured in terms of Oedipus, the cards are stacked against us, and the only real relationship, that of production, has been done away with. The great discovery of psychoanalysis was that of the production of desire, of the productions of the unconscious. But once Oedipus entered the picture, this discovery was soon buried beneath a new brand of idealism. A classical theatre was substituted for the unconscious as a factory. Representation was substituted for the units of production of the unconscious. And an unconscious that was capable of nothing but expressing itself, in myth, tragedy, dreams, was substituted for the productive unconscious. Every time that the problem of schizophrenia is explained in terms of the ego, all we can do is sample a supposed essence or a presumed specific nature of the schizo, regardless of whether we do so with love and pity or disgustedly spit out the mouthful we have tasted. We have sampled him once as a disassociated ego, another time as an ego cut off from the world, and yet again, most temptingly, as an ego that had not ceased to be, who was there in the most specific way. But in his very own world, though he might reveal himself to a clever psychiatrist, a sympathetic super-observer, in short, a phenomenologist. Let us remember once again one of Marx's caveats. We cannot tell from the mere taste of wheat who grew it. The product gives us no hint as to the system and the relations of production. The product appears to be all the more specific, incredibly specific, and readily describable. The more closely the theoretician relates it to the ideal forms of causation, comprehension, or expression, rather than to the real process of production on which it depends. The schizophrenic appears all the more specific and recognizable as a distinct personality if the process is halted, or if it is made an end and a goal in itself, or if it is allowed to go on endlessly in a void, so as to provoke that horror of extremity wherein the soul and body ultimately perish. The autist. Kraepelin's celebrated terminal state. But the moment that one describes, on the contrary, the material process of production, the specificity of the product tends to evaporate, while at the same time the possibility of another outcome, another end result of the process appears. Before being a mental state of the schizophrenic who has made himself into an artificial person through autism, schizophrenia is the process of the production of desire and desiring machines. How does one get from one to the other, and is this transition inevitable? This remains the crucial question. Karl Jaspers has given us precious insights on this point, as on so many others, because his idealism was remarkably atypical. Contrasting the concept of process with those of reaction formation or development of the personality, he views process as a rupture or intrusion, having nothing to do with an imaginary relationship with the ego. Rather, it is a relationship with the demoniacal in nature. The one thing Jaspers failed to do was to view process as material economic reality, as the process of production wherein nature equals industry, nature equals history. To a certain degree, the traditional logic of desire is all wrong from the very outset, from the very first step that the Platonic logic of desire forces us to take, making us choose between production and acquisition. From the moment that we place desire on the side of acquisition, we make desire an idealistic, dialectical, nihilistic conception, which causes us to look upon it as primarily a lack of an object, a lack of the real object. It is true that the other side, the production side, has not been entirely ignored. Kant, for instance, must be credited with effecting a critical revolution as regards the theory of desire, by attributing to it the faculty of being, through its representations, the cause of the reality of the objects of these representations. But it is not by chance that Kant chooses superstitious beliefs, hallucinations, and fantasies as illustrations of this definition of desire. As Kant would have it, we are well aware that the real object can be produced only by an external causality and external mechanisms. Nonetheless, this knowledge does not prevent us from believing in the intrinsic power of desire to create its own object, if only in an unreal, hallucinatory, or delirious form, or from representing this causality as stemming from within desire itself. The reality of the object, insofar as it is produced by desire, is thus a psychic reality. Hence, it can be said that Kant's critical revolution changes nothing essential. This way of conceiving of productivity does not question the validity of the classical conception of desire as a lack. Rather, it uses this conception as a support and a buttress, and merely examines its implications more carefully. In point of fact, if desire is the lack of the real object, its very nature as a real entity depends upon an essence of lack that produces the fantasized object. Desire thus conceived of as production, though merely the production of fantasies, has been explained perfectly by psychoanalysis. On the very lowest level of interpretation, this means that the real object that desire lacks is related to an extrinsic, natural, or social production, whereas desire intrinsically produces an imaginary object that functions as a double of reality, as though there were a dreamed-of object behind every real object, or a mental production behind all real productions. This conception does not necessarily compel psychoanalysis to engage in a study of gadgets and markets in the form of an utterly dreary and dull psychoanalysis of the object. Psychoanalytic studies of packages of noodles, cars, or thingamajigs. But even when the fantasy is interpreted in depth, not simply as an object, but as a specific machine that brings desire itself front and center, this machine is merely theatrical, and the complementarity of what it sets apart still remains. It is now need that is defined in terms of a relative lack and determined by its own object, whereas desire is regarded as what produces the fantasy and produces itself by detaching itself from the object, though at the same time it intensifies the lack by making it absolute. An incurable insufficiency of being, an inability to be that is life itself. Hence the presentation of desire as something supported by needs, while these needs, and their relationship to the object as something that is lacking or missing, continue to be the basis of the productivity of desire, theory of an underlying support. In a word, when a theoretician reduces desiring production to a production of fantasy, he is content to exploit to the fullest the idealist principle that defines desire as a lack, rather than a process of production, of industrial production. Clément Rosset puts it very well. Every time the emphasis is put on a lack that desire supposedly suffers from as a way of defining its object, the world acquires as its double some other sort of world, in accordance with the following line of argument. There is an object that desire feels the lack of. Hence the world does not contain each and every object that exists. There is at least one object missing, the one that desire feels the lack of. Hence there exists some other place that contains the key to desire, missing in this world. If desire produces, its product is real. If desire is productive, it can be productive only in the real world and can produce only reality. Desire is the set of passive syntheses that engineer partial objects, flows, and bodies, and that function as units of production. The real is the end product, the result of the passive syntheses of desire as autoproduction of the unconscious. Desire does not lack anything. It does not lack its object. It is, rather, the subject that is missing in desire, or a desire that lacks a fixed subject. There is no fixed subject unless there is repression. Desire and its object are one and the same thing, the machine as a machine of a machine. Desire is a machine, and the object of desire is another machine connected to it. Hence, the product is something removed or deducted from the process of producing. Between the act of producing and the product, something becomes detached, thus giving the vagabond, nomad subject a residuum. The objective being of desire is the real in and of itself. Note, Lacan's admirable theory of desire appears to us to have two poles. One related to the object small a as a desiring machine, which defines desire in terms of a real production, thus going beyond both any idea of need and any idea of fantasy. And the other related to the great other as a signifier, which reintroduces a certain notion of lack. In Serge Leclaire's article, La réalité du désir, the oscillation between these two poles can be seen quite clearly. End note. There is no particular form of existence that can be labeled psychic reality. As Marx notes, what exists in fact is not lack but passion, as a natural and sensuous object. Desire is not bolstered by needs, but rather the contrary. Needs are derived from desire. They are counterproducts within the real that desire produces. Lack is a counter-effect of desire. It is deposited, distributed, vacuolized within a real that is natural and social. Desire always remains in close touch with the conditions of objective existence. It embraces them and follows them, shifts when they shift, and does not outlive them. For that reason, it so often becomes the desire to die, whereas need is a measure of the withdrawal of a subject that has lost its desire, at the same time that it loses the passive syntheses of these conditions. This is precisely the significance of need as a search in a void, hunting about, trying to capture or become a parasite of passive syntheses in whatever vague world they may happen to exist in. It is no use saying, we are not green plants. We have long since been unable to synthesize chlorophyll, so it's necessary to eat. Desire then becomes this abject fear of lacking something. But it should be noted that this is not a phrase uttered by the poor or the dispossessed. On the contrary, such people know that they are close to grass, almost akin to it, and that desire needs very few things. Not those leftovers that chance to come their way, but the very things that are continually taken from them. And that what is missing is not things a subject feels the lack of somewhere deep down inside himself, but rather the objectivity of man, the objective being of man, for whom to desire is to produce within the realm of the real. The real is not impossible. On the contrary, within the real everything is possible, everything becomes possible. Desire does not express a molar lack within the subject. Rather, the molar organization deprives desire of its objective being. Revolutionaries, artists, and seers are content to be objective, merely objective. They know that desire clasps life in its powerfully productive embrace and reproduces it in a way that is all the more intense because it has few needs. And never mind those who believe that this is very easy to say, or that it is the sort of idea to be found in books. From the little reading I had done, I had observed that the men who were most in life, who were moulding life, who were life itself, ate little, slept little, owned little or nothing. They had no illusions about duty, or the perpetuation of their kith and kin, or the preservation of the state. The phantasmal world is the world which has never been fully conquered over. It is the world of the past, never of the future. To move forward clinging to the past is like dragging a ball and chain. Henry Miller. The true visionary is a Spinoza in the garb of a Neapolitan revolutionary. We know very well where lack and its subjective correlative come from. Lack, manque, is created, planned, and organized in and through social production. It is counterproduced as a result of the pressure of anti-production. The latter falls back on, se rabat sur, the forces of production and appropriates them. It is never primary. Production is never organized on the basis of a pre-existing need or lack, manque. It is lack that infiltrates itself, creates empty spaces or vacuoles, and propagates itself in accordance with the organization of an already existing organization of production. Note. Maurice Clavel remarks, apropos of Jean-Paul Sartre, that a Marxist philosophy cannot allow itself to introduce the notion of scarcity as its initial premise. Such a scarcity, antedating exploitation, makes of the law of supply and demand a reality that will remain forever independent, since it is situated at a primordial level. Hence, it is no longer a question of including or deducing this law within Marxism, since it is immediately evident at a prior stage, at a level from which Marxism itself derives. Being a rigorous thinker, Marx refuses to employ the notion of scarcity, and is quite correct to do so. For this category would be his undoing. In Qui est alien. End note. The deliberate creation of lack as a function of market economy is the art of a dominant class. This involves deliberately organizing wants and needs, manque, amid an abundance of production, making all of desire teeter and fall victim to the great fear of not having one's needs satisfied, and making the object dependent upon a real production that is supposedly exterior to desire, the demands of rationality, while at the same time the production of desire is categorized as fantasy and nothing but fantasy. There is no such thing as the social production of reality on the one hand, and a desiring production that is mere fantasy on the other. The only connections that could be established between these two productions would be secondary ones of introjection and projection, as though all social practices had their precise counterpart in introjected or internal mental practices, or as though mental practices were projected upon social systems, without either of the two sets of practices ever having any real or concrete effect upon the other. As long as we are content to establish a perfect parallel between money, gold, capital, and the capitalist triangle on the one hand, and the libido, the anus, the phallus, and the family triangle on the other, we are engaging in an enjoyable pastime. But the mechanisms of money remain totally unaffected by the anal projections of those who manipulate money. The Marx-Freud parallelism between the two remains utterly sterile and insignificant, as long as it is expressed in terms that make them introjections or projections of each other without ceasing to be utterly alien to each other, as in the famous equation, money equals shit. The truth of the matter is that social production is purely and simply desiring production itself under determinate conditions. We maintain that the social field is immediately invested by desire, that it is the historically determined product of desire, and that libido has no need of any mediation or sublimation, any psychic operation, any transformation, in order to invade and invest the productive forces and the relations of production. There is only desire and the social, and nothing else. Even the most repressive and the most deadly forms of social reproduction are produced by desire within the organization that is the consequence of such production under various conditions that we must analyze. That is why the fundamental problem of political philosophy is still precisely the one that Spinoza saw so clearly and that Wilhelm Reich rediscovered. Why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? How can people possibly reach the point of shouting, "More taxes, less bread"? As Reich remarks, the astonishing thing is not that some people steal or that others occasionally go out on strike, but rather that all those who are starving do not steal as a regular practice, and all those who are exploited are not continually out on strike. After centuries of exploitation, why do people still tolerate being humiliated and enslaved, to such a point, indeed, that they actually want humiliation and slavery, not only for others, but for themselves? Reich is at his profoundest as a thinker when he refuses to accept ignorance or illusion on the part of the masses as an explanation of fascism, and demands an explanation that will take their desires into account, an explanation formulated in terms of desire. No, the masses were not innocent dupes. At a certain point, under a certain set of conditions, they wanted fascism, and it is this perversion of the desire of the masses that needs to be accounted for. Yet Reich himself never manages to provide a satisfactory explanation of this phenomenon, because at a certain point he reintroduces precisely the line of argument that he was in the process of demolishing, by creating a distinction between rationality, as it is or ought to be in the process of social production, and the irrational element in desire, and by regarding only this latter as a suitable subject for psychoanalytic investigation. Hence, the sole task he assigns psychoanalysis is the explanation of the negative, the subjective, the inhibited within the social field. He therefore necessarily returns to a dualism between the real object rationally produced on the one hand and irrational, fantasizing production on the other. Note: we find in the case of culturalists a distinction between rational systems and projective systems, with psychoanalysis applying only to these latter, as for example in Abram Kardiner. Despite their hostility to culturalism, we find in both Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse certain traces of this dualism, even though they define the rational and the irrational in a completely different way and assign them quite different roles. End note. He gives up trying to discover the common denominator or the coextension of the social field and desire. In order to establish the basis for a genuinely materialistic psychiatry, there was a category that Reich was sorely in need of, that of desiring production, which would apply to the real in both its so-called rational and irrational forms. The fact there is massive social repression that has an enormous effect on desiring production in no way vitiates our principle. Desire produces reality, or stated another way, desiring production is one and the same thing as social production. It is not possible to attribute a special form of existence to desire, a mental or psychic reality that is presumably different from the material reality of social production. Desiring machines are not fantasy machines or dream machines, which supposedly can be distinguished from technical and social machines. Rather, fantasies are secondary expressions, deriving from the identical nature of the two sorts of machines in any given set of circumstances. Thus, fantasy is never individual. It is group fantasy, as institutional analysis has successfully demonstrated. And if there is such a thing as two sorts of group fantasy, it is because two different readings of this identity are possible, depending upon whether the desiring machines are regarded from the point of view of the great gregarious masses that they form, or whether social machines are considered from the point of view of the elementary forces of desire that serve as a basis for them. Hence, in group fantasy, the libido may invest all of an existing social field, including the latter's most repressive forms, or, on the contrary, it may launch a counter-investment whereby revolutionary desire is plugged into the existing social field as a source of energy. The great socialist utopias of the 19th century function, for example, not as ideal models, but as group fantasies, that is, as agents of the real productivity of desire, making it possible to disinvest the current social field, to de-institutionalize it, to further the revolutionary institution of desire itself. But there is never any difference in nature between the desiring machines and the technical social machines. There is a certain distinction between them, but it is merely a distinction of regime, depending on their relationships of size. Except for this difference in regime, they are the same machines, as group fantasies clearly prove. When, in the course of our discussion above, we laid down the broad outlines of a parallelism between social production and desiring production, in order to show that in both cases there is a strong tendency on the part of the forces of anti-production to operate retroactively on, se rebattre sur, productive forms and appropriate them, this parallelism was in no way meant as an exhaustive description of the relationship between the two systems of production. It merely enables us to point to certain phenomena having to do with the difference in regime between them. In the first place, technical machines obviously work only if they are not out of order. They ordinarily stop working not because they break down, but because they wear out. Marx makes use of this simple principle to show that the regime of technical machines is characterized by a strict distinction between the means of production and the product. Thanks to this distinction, the machine transmits value to the product, but only the value that the machine itself loses as it wears out. Desiring machines, on the contrary, continually break down as they run, and in fact run only when they are not functioning properly. The product is always an offshoot of production, implanting itself upon it like a graft, and at the same time the parts of the machine are the fuel that makes it run. Art often takes advantage of this property of desiring machines by creating veritable group fantasies in which desiring production is used to short-circuit social production, and to interfere with the reproductive function of technical machines by introducing an element of dysfunction. Armand's charred violins, for instance, or César's compressed car bodies. More generally, Dali's method of critical paranoia assures the explosion of a desiring machine within an object of social production. But even earlier, Ravel preferred to throw his inventions entirely out of gear rather than let them simply run down, and choose to end his compositions with abrupt breaks, hesitations, tremolos, discordant notes, and unresolved chords, rather than allowing them to slowly wind down to a close or gradually die away into silence. The artist is the master of objects. He puts before us shattered, burned, broken down objects, converting them to the regime of desiring machines. Breaking down is part of the very functioning of desiring machines. The artist presents paranoiac machines, miraculating machines, and celibate machines as so many technical machines, so as to cause desiring machines to undermine technical machines. Even more important, the work of art is itself a desiring machine. The artist stores up his treasures so as to create an immediate explosion, and that is why, to his way of thinking, destructions can never take place as rapidly as they ought to. From this, a second difference in regime results. Desiring machines produce anti-production all by themselves, whereas the anti-production characteristic of technical machines takes place only within the extrinsic conditions of the reproduction of the process, even though these conditions do not come into being at some later stage. That is why technical machines are not an economic category, and always refer back to a socius or a social machine that is quite distinct from these machines, and that conditions this reproduction. A technical machine is therefore not a cause, but merely an index of a general form of social production. Thus, there are manual machines and primitive societies, hydraulic machines and Asiatic forms of society, industrial machines and capitalism. Hence, when we posited the socius as the analogue of a full body without organs, there was nonetheless one important difference. For desiring machines are the fundamental category of the economy of desire. They produce a body without organs all by themselves, and make no distinction between agents and their own parts, or between their relations of production and their own relations, or between the social order and technology. Desiring machines are both technical and social. It is in this sense that desiring production is the locus of a primal psychic repression, whereas social production is where social repression takes place, and it is between the former and the latter that there occurs something that resembles secondary psychic repression in the strictest sense. The situation of the body without organs or its equivalent is the crucial factor here, depending on whether it is the result of an internal process or of an extrinsic condition, and thus affects the role of the death instinct in particular. But at the same time, they are the same machines, despite the fact that they are governed by two different regimes, and despite the fact that it is admittedly a strange adventure for desire to desire repression. There is only one kind of production, the production of the real. And doubtless we can express this identity in two different ways, even though these two ways together constitute the auto-production of the unconscious as a cycle. We can say that social production, under determinate conditions, derives primarily from desiring production, which is to say that homo natura comes first. But we must also say, more accurately, that desiring production is first and foremost social in nature, and tends to free itself only at the end, which is to say that homo historia comes first. The body without organs is not an original primordial entity that later projects itself into different sorts of socius, as though it were a raving paranoiac, the chieftain of the primitive horde, who was initially responsible for social organization. The social machine or socius may be the body of the earth, the body of the despot, the body of money. It is never a projection, however, of the body without organs. On the contrary, the body without organs is the ultimate residuum of a deterritorialized socius. The prime function incumbent upon the socius has always been to codify the flows of desire, to inscribe them, to record them, to see to it that no flow exists that is not properly dammed up, channeled, regulated. When the primitive territorial machine proved inadequate to the task, the despotic machine set up a kind of overcoding system. But the capitalist machine insofar as it was built on the ruins of a despotic state, more or less far removed in time, finds itself in a totally new situation. It is faced with the task of decoding and deterritorializing the flows. Capitalism does not confront this situation from the outside, since it experiences it as the very fabric of its existence, as both its primary determinant and its fundamental raw material, its form and its function, and deliberately perpetuates it in all its violence, with all the powers at its command. Its sovereign production and repression can be achieved in no other way. Capitalism is in fact born of the encounter of two sorts of flows: the decoded flows of production in the form of money capital, and the decoded flows of labor in the form of the free worker. Hence, unlike previous social machines, the capitalist machine is incapable of providing a code that will apply to the whole of the social field. By substituting money for the very notion of a code, it has created an axiomatic of abstract quantities that keeps moving further and further in the direction of the deterritorialization of the socius. Capitalism tends toward a threshold of decoding that will destroy the socius in order to make it a body without organs and unleash the flows of desire on this body as a deterritorialized field. Is it correct to say that, in this sense, schizophrenia is the product of the capitalist machine, as manic depression and paranoia are the product of the despotic machine, and hysteria the product of the territorial machine? Note: on hysteria, schizophrenia, and their relationships with social structures, see the analyses of Georges Devereux in his Essai d'Ethnopsychiatrie Générale, and the wonderful pages in Karl Jaspers' Strindberg und Van Gogh. The question has been asked: is madness in our time a state of total sincerity, in areas where, in less chaotic times, one would have been capable of honest experience and expression without it? Jaspers reformulates this question by adding, "We have seen that in former times human beings attempted to drive themselves into hysteria, and we might say that today many human beings attempt to drive themselves into madness in much the same way. But if the former attempt was, to a certain extent, psychologically possible, the latter is not possible at all, and can lead only to inauthenticity." End note. The decoding of flows and the deterritorialization of the socius thus constitutes the most characteristic and the most important tendency of capitalism. It continually draws near to its limit, which is a genuinely schizophrenic limit. It tends with all the strength at its command to produce the schizo as the subject of the decoded flows on the body without organs, more capitalist than the capitalist and more proletarian than the proletariat. This tendency is being carried further and further, to the point that capitalism with all its flows may dispatch itself straight to the moon. We really haven't seen anything yet. When we say that schizophrenia is our characteristic malady, the malady of our era, we do not merely mean to say that modern life drives people mad. It is not a question of a way of life, but of a process of production. Nor is it merely a question of a simple parallelism, even though from the point of view of the failure of codes, such a parallelism is a much more precise formulation of the relationship between, for example, the phenomena of shifting of meaning in the case of schizophrenics, and the mechanisms of ever-increasing disharmony and discord at every level of industrial society. What we are really trying to say is that capitalism, through its process of production, produces an awesome schizophrenic accumulation of energy or charge, against which it brings all its vast powers of repression to bear, but which nonetheless continues to act as capitalism's limit. For capitalism constantly counteracts, constantly inhibits this inherent tendency, while at the same time allowing it free rein. It continually seeks to avoid reaching its limit while simultaneously tending toward that limit. Capitalism institutes or restores all sorts of residual and artificial, imaginary or symbolic territorialities, thereby attempting, as best it can, to recode, to rechannel persons who have been defined in terms of abstract quantities. Everything returns or recurs. States, nations, families. That is what makes the ideology of capitalism a motley painting of everything that has ever been believed. The real is not impossible. It is simply more and more artificial. Marx termed the twofold movement of the tendency to a falling rate of profit and the increase in the absolute quantity of surplus value, the law of the counteracted tendency. As a corollary of this law, there is the twofold movement of decoding or deterritorializing flows on the one hand, and their violent and artificial reterritorialization on the other. The more the capitalist machine deterritorializes, decoding and axiomatizing flows in order to extract surplus value from them, the more its ancillary apparatuses, such as government bureaucracies and the forces of law and order, do their utmost to reterritorialize, absorbing in the process a larger and larger share of surplus value. There is no doubt that at this point in history, the neurotic, the pervert, and the psychotic cannot be adequately defined in terms of drives, for drives are simply the desiring machines themselves. They must be defined in terms of modern territorialities. The neurotic is trapped within the residual or artificial territorialities of our societies and reduces all of them, les rabattus, to Oedipus as the ultimate territoriality, as reconstructed in the analyst's office and projected upon the full body of the psychoanalyst. Yes, my boss is my father, and so is the chief of state. And so are you, doctor. The pervert is someone who takes the artifice seriously and plays the game to the hilt. If you want them, you can have them. Territoriality is infinitely more artificial than the ones that society offers us. Totally artificial new families. Secret lunar societies. As for the schizo, continually wandering about, migrating here, there, and everywhere as best he can, he plunges further and further into the realm of deterritorialization, reaching the furthest limits of the decomposition of the socius on the surface of his own body without organs. It may well be that these peregrinations are the schizo's own particular way of rediscovering the earth. The schizophrenic deliberately seeks out the very limit of capitalism. He is the inherent tendency brought to fulfillment, its surplus product, its proletariat, and its exterminating angel. He scrambles all the codes and is the transmitter of the decoded flows of desire. The real continues to flow. In the schizo, the two aspects of process are conjoined. The metaphysical process that puts us in contact with the demoniacal element in nature, or within the heart of the earth, and the historical process of social production that restores the autonomy of desiring machines in relation to the deterritorialized social machine. Schizophrenia is desiring production as the limit of social production. Desiring production and its difference in regime as compared to social production are thus endpoints, not points of departure. Between the two, there is nothing but an ongoing process of becoming that is the becoming of reality. And if materialist psychiatry may be defined as the psychiatry that introduces the concept of production into consideration of the problem of desire, it cannot avoid posing, in eschatological terms, the problem of the ultimate relationship between the analytic machine, the revolutionary machine, and desiring machines.